Chapter 3 of Stones and Water by Donna Jo Napoli. Picks. The sudden breaking jerked Roberto awake. Memo's head rested on his right shoulder. Samuel's head was in his lap. The rocking of the train had been like a rocking of a gondola, almost soothing. But now it was over. Roberto rubbed his eyes. Memo woke an instant later. He looked around as if he didn't know where he was. Roberto shook Samuel awake. The three of them stood at the window with the other three boys from their bench seat. The sign on the station read München, or Munich. "Munich," said one of the other boys. The boy said a few more things in a dialect Roberto didn't recognize, but the gist of it was easy enough to understand. They had arrived at the Bavarian capital of Germany. "Good," whispered Samuel to Roberto. "I've got to pee, and I've always wanted to pee on German soil." Roberto could use a bathroom himself. The stench of urine made the air heavy. He looked down at Samuel's pants, but they were dry. Now he smelled feces too, and everywhere the sour smell of dried sweat assailed him. His stomach turned. He was suddenly glad it was empty. The doors opened. The soldiers yapped orders at the boys, but without energy they sounded like tired dogs. One of them put both hands behind his neck, elbows forward, and stretched. He yawned. Maybe the soldiers hadn't slept at all. The soldiers stood up and yapped louder. Now they swung their batons, whapping a shoulder, cracking across a back. The boys filed off the train and onto the platforms. Roberto thought of the boys who'd been shot at the border. His stomach turned again. He said nothing. He would do nothing to call attention to himself. That's what Sergio had meant, and now he realized. Everyone seemed to be following the same strategy. They huddled together, silent in the cool wet of pre-dawn, their knees sticking out of their short pants like naked pine trunks, on the Lido in Venice. A soldier walked up and down in front of them. He wore the same high black boots, the same wide black belt, and the same armband with a swastika as the others. But he had a black patch on each collar tip with two white zigzag lines, and his helmet had the same two zigzag lines in black on a white background. The soldier spoke loudly. He held his crotch. Then he put one hand to his open mouth as though he was putting something in it. He chewed big. The boys nodded. Yes, they needed to use the bathroom. Yes, they were hungry. The man pointed. The boys shuffled off the platform and relieved themselves in the dry grass by the wall of the station. Memo kept close on one side of Samuel. Roberto kept close on the other. Soldiers walked among the boys, handing them hunks of dense, sweet-smelling dark bread and shouting, "Brat." Other soldiers followed, each carrying a bucket of water and a tin cup. Wasser. The boys drank fast. Roberto scanned the crowd of older boys on the other side of the station. Was that Sergio? He waved. A soldier came up and said something. "I was just trying to see my brother." The soldier hit him in the shoulder with the butt of his rifle. Roberto let out a yelp. His brat flew out of his hand. He staggered backward. He looked down. "Keep your mouth shut, do what everyone else does. Keep your mouth shut, do what everyone else does." The soldier shook his rifle threateningly at Roberto. Then he walked on. Samuel picked up the brat and handed it to Roberto without looking at him, but he touched him gently on the shoulder. Roberto brushed the dirt off the brat. He ate in big, greedy bites. His shoulder ached something awful, but the brat was good. He could sink his teeth into it. He could chew and chew. He would think of nothing but the brat filling the huge hole in his stomach. He blinked his burning eyes and ate. His nose ran. He wiped it with the back of his hand. Soldiers shouted orders to the group of older boys now. They were being sorted by their city of origin. That much was easy to understand. Roberto saw Sergio take his place with the boys who had gotten on the train in Mestre. Then a soldier went by and picked one boy from each group and marched off with them down the road. Another soldier did the same, always picking only one boy from each group. "I'll go with the boys from Bolzano," said Memo. He looked at Samuel. "Enzo, you go with the boys from Trento. That way we can try to wind up in the same group, right?" "Enzo?" said Roberto in confusion. "What, did you forget my name?" Samuel looked at Roberto meaningfully, but he scratched his chest. "It's a good Catholic nickname." Roberto blinked. He felt stupid, and that scared him worse. Of course, he knew Samuel was a Jewish name. He just hadn't thought fast enough. He had to think fast, much faster, like Memo. He rubbed his shoulder where the rifle butt had hit him. He checked. Sergio still hadn't been chosen yet. The soldiers shouted orders at the younger boys now. The group from Mestra and Venice was forming. Roberto's hand went to his St. Christopher medal. "Go on," whispered Memo. "When they pick you, I'll step to the front of my group, and maybe they'll pick me, too. It's a good idea, right?" Roberto watched Samuel nod. No, not Samuel. Enzo. Roberto had to think of him as Enzo from now on so he wouldn't accidentally give him away. Roberto quickly unclasped the chain around his neck. He kissed the medal and handed it to Enzo. Then he ran to the Mestra Venice group. Only a Catholic boy would wear a St. Christopher's medal, and Roberto would be okay without it. He'd be okay. The groups from Padova, Verona, Trento, and Bolzano formed. Soldiers walked by, picking one boy from each group. Roberto tried to see what was happening with the bigger boys, but his view was blocked. He stepped to the front. A soldier gestured for him to come. Roberto walked behind him from group to group. He looked over at the bigger boys' group. Sergio was gone. Enzo was waiting at the front of the Trento group. The soldier picked him. Enzo took his place behind the soldier. He didn't look at Roberto. Roberto's chain showed at Enzo's neckline with the medal hidden inside his shirt. They walked on to the Bolzano group. Memo was standing at the front. The soldier picked the boy beside Memo. Roberto swallowed the lump in his throat. He didn't dare look back over his shoulder as they walked away. The soldier walked ahead of the 5 boys in Roberto's group through city block after city block. Morning had come and the air was full of the sweet smells of baking. Motorcycles roared past them. Bicyclists crowded the streets. A group of children younger than Roberto, they were maybe 10 or 11, shouted at them and spat. They taunted with a single word over and over, "Juden, Juden, Juden." The soldier called back, something about Italiener, Italians. The German children stopped their shouts. They ran on. The group walked through the streets and no one else. No one beyond the German children said anything to them. No one acted as though there was anything odd about soldiers marching boys through the streets. In Venice, everyone would have gawked. Soldiers shouldn't be bothering with children. Someone should protest. Mama would have protested. All of the women of Cannaregio would have protested. Someone should speak for the boys. Roberto remembered the boy on the train guessing that they were going to become soldiers. Maybe they were heading off to a training camp, infantry or cavalry. Still, they shouldn't have just been taken like that. The more he breathed the fresh morning air, the more angry he became. Then the image of the 3 boys lying in their own blood on the train platform blotted out the anger. The image seemed too grotesque to be real. The soldier walked the group of 5 out of town and down a country road through the woods. Roberto's stomach wouldn't stop growling. Memo would have laughed, maybe. They came to an open area where trees had been cut down. Boys Roberto's age worked with picks and shovels. The soldiers led them to a truck at the edge of the clearing. He shouted at them. Enzo grabbed a pick out of the back of the truck. The soldier nodded and said something. Roberto grabbed a pick. The other 3 boys took picks. They followed the soldier down to the clearing in a section that hadn't been worked yet. The soldier pointed. The boys swung their picks. The soldier watched for a while, his arms folded on his chest. Then he walked off to talk with another soldier. One of the boys said something in a dialect Roberto couldn't understand. Roberto spoke out of the side of his mouth, which seemed to be the way all of them were speaking now. It was stupid of them to mix boys from different towns. Now we can't speak to each other comfortably. Enzo hissed, "Stupid like a fox." "What do you mean?" "If we can't talk like buddies, if we have to use school Italian with each other, then we can understand enough to work together, but we won't become buddies. We won't help each other." Enzo swung his pick hard. "We're lost." Roberto gripped the handle of his pick tight. He wasn't lost. He had Enzo. He swung the pick. "What's the point of tilling a field out here? The soil's nothing but rocks." "Be careful, they're looking at us." Roberto snuck a glance over his shoulder. A different soldier watched them. Roberto turned his head down and swung with all his might. When he dared to peek again, the soldier had left. Roberto spoke without looking at Enzo and without pausing his pick. It's stupid to till this rocky earth. Maybe it's not for planting. So what were they digging? War trenches? The newsreels were full of war trenches, but who is going to fight a battle out here in these woods? What else could they be digging? Graves? Graves for the returned bodies of dead German soldiers? No, please, please don't let it be graves. They picked and picked. The sun was hot. Roberto panted. His tongue went dry as a withered pine cone. He thought of the rocking of a gondola, the rocking of a train. He picked in rhythm with that rocking. One of the boys fell. He got up quickly. He said something about water. Roberto needed water too. He stopped for a moment and looked around. The shade of the woods beckoned. The fingers of both his hands were curled into claws, stiff from holding the same position for so long. He leaned the pick against his leg and stretched his fingers. Flexing for an attack, said Enzo. Forget it. What? A pick against a gun, said Enzo, swinging his pick. He'd shoot you before you got close enough. It won't work. Swing your pick, Roberto. Please, swing it. Roberto hadn't thought about matching his pick to a gun. It wasn't that at all. He'd thought simply about resting. Now he considered his pick as he swung. It could split a man's throat if it was handled right. Nausea rose to Roberto's mouth. He swallowed. His throat hurt. His shoulder throbbed. The first soldier came back. Through shouts and gestures, the boys understood to put down their picks. They followed him to the truck and sat on the ground near another group of boys. The soldier barked. They got up and sat again, farther away this time. Each boy was given a boiled potato and a hunk of brought. They ate in silence. The soldiers came around with a familiar tin cup and water bucket. Roberto heard a motor. Another army truck came up the road and parked in the clearing. Soldiers jumped out of the rear. The soldiers in charge of the boys talked with the new soldiers. Someone unfolded a map. Their voices rose in excitement. They pointed to other places on the map. The boys beside Roberto dropped sideways on the ground, his eyes shut. His potato rolled out of his hand. A soldier glanced over at him. He shouted. The boy didn't move. The soldier walked toward them. Roberto pinched the boy. Sit up, he whispered. The soldier shouted at Roberto. Roberto looked down. He curled his shoulders to protect them from the rifle butt. The soldier kicked the boy in the side. The boy didn't flinch. And now Roberto was sure. The boy had fainted. Roberto pulled his knees up to his chest and wrapped his arms around his legs. Keep your mouth shut. Do what everyone else does. The soldier kicked the boy again. His boots were thick and heavy. They could crush the boy's chest. The soldier stepped back for a harder kick. Roberto couldn't stand it any longer. He fainted. The soldier shouted at Roberto. He grabbed him by the front of the shirt and pulled him to his feet. He pushed him toward the group of soldiers. He said something to them. Then he let go of Roberto and walked back to the boy who had fainted. He shot him. Roberto clapped his hand over his mouth to hold in the scream. Someone pushed him against the back of the truck and shouted and slapped both his cheeks. Roberto was biting on his hand now, biting hard. The soldier shouted in his face and pulled his hand away from his mouth. It took Roberto a few seconds to focus, but he finally understood what the soldier wanted. He climbed into the back of the truck. He shut his eyes. Then he quickly opened them again. It was better to see everything and stay ready. Another boy was pushed into the truck. He was big. His neck was thick and strong. A third climbed in. He was big too. The boys glanced at one another, then looked away. 2 more boys climbed into the truck. The engine rumbled. Roberto was going somewhere else again, and this time he was going alone. Alone. The thought petrified him. His head swam. Enzo climbed in. His eyes were ice. He didn't look at anyone. Vomit covered his chin and a trickle of blood ran down his temple, but he didn't seem to notice. He sat with his back straight in the middle of the truck bed. Roberto understood. Enzo had managed to get himself into the truck, and that's all that mattered. Enzo had paid the passage in flesh to keep them together. Roberto vowed he would do the same. Whatever the cost, he'd stay with Enzo. They were a team. As long as they stayed together, they would be all right. They had to stay together. 3 soldiers got on. A truck rolled out of the clearing. They bumped their way down the country road.